So in 2020, Lady Musgrave Trust started talking to people and organisations about thinking about ways to improve access by women in crisis to their handy guide by moving it online, which is a great advance. Their focus was on not just on developing the guide and shifting it online, but also, besides it being more accessible, they wanted to provide some information in relation to family and domestic violence. So they spoke to individual women, women's services, organisations, employers, representing employers, workers, families and children, school, disability, police, people with lived experience, people who had recently arrived, women who'd recently arrived in the community to develop this. And so this broad selection of stakeholders helped Lady Musgrave to understand what information was most valuable to women when they experienced domestic and family violence, and what information and services needed to be shared through the guide. But there was one theme, there was one consistent message well, there was a number, but one of them that was of concern to almost everyone they spoke to was access to pornography. And, you know, I've been given some really useful notes here, but I think about this. Last century, when I started my career, I worked for the Institute of Criminology, and I did a project around regulating the sex industry, and my task was to think about how to regulate pornography. Pornography then was in magazines and videos, and the Australian Censorship Board used to look at everything, but enter the internet, and there's been a transformation. It's easy, it's fast, it's cheap, it's borderless, it's abundant, it's unlimited, unregulated and private. And so that presents challenges, particularly in relation to young people. The young age of initial access, especially by boys, to content that's violent and controlling, content that represents women in submissive stereotypes and promotes highly sexual, highly risky practices, contributes to feeding unrealistic and even illegal expectations of many young people long before they enter into relationships. So it shapes the way they think about intimacy and the way they think about relationships. This increased access to pornography impacts on their attitudes and expectations as they enter relationships, and particularly around their attitudes and expectations around entitlement and the important matter of consent. This then leads into the development of acceptance to coercive behaviours. And this is confirmed by a great report by Our Watch, which demonstrates the link between the availability of pornography and violence towards women. So just to give you some figures from that report, it identified that nearly half, 48% of young men have seen pornography by the age of 13 and 48% of young women by 15. And on average, young men are viewing pornography for the first time 3 years before they get into their first sexual relationship. So that's where they learn about, well, what they might think of as intimacy. So contributors to the research conducted by the Lady Musgrave Trust identified this as a problem, but also the extreme gender stereotyping within pornography as incredibly problematic. So in this context, we see sexting, self-made videos of sex or intimate images, and then that leads to consequential revenge porn actions and issues that disproportionately impact in very negative and damaging ways on young people and young women in particular. And these are linked to this early and wide access to pornography. The gendered nature of domestic and family violence needs no explanation, and we've already heard, you know, heartbreaking stories in relation to that. Neither does the increased prominence being given by media to issues of continued male dominance and attitudes of entitlement. I think of the tidal wave of the Me Too movement, which spread across the globe almost overnight, and the examples that are played out in our own national capital. So I guess many of you, I've been talking a lot about gender violence and I've been talking a lot about sex and pornography, so you might be thinking, okay, you know, I get the sex control thing, but what's it got to do with homelessness? You know, until we address some of these really deep undercurrents in our community, we'll never really understand why, after the promise of the second wave of feminism, where we optimistically thought everything would change, why women still, why we still live in a society where women and men are not equal. And whilst ever this is the case, women will disproportionately find themselves in controlling relationships. And as we heard in that really heart-wrenching story of lived experience, the price is leaving and homelessness. So that's why we have this panel, and we're going to look deeper into this issue with our terrific panellists here. So I might start with Karen. Can you tell us a bit briefly about your experience of how pornography impacts relationship and ultimately leads to homelessness?
So I guess in the Gold Coast Centre Against Sexual Violence, we work with young women from 14 years and up. So we're really seeing a lot of young women in the early years of high school presenting and identifying with a much more adult service in relation to much more adult experiences of sexual violence. So I think that's been a really big shift over the last 5 to 10 years of what we've seen in the service there. But in terms of pornography, I guess firstly it's important to acknowledge that Moira Carmody really puts forward the premise that there are lots of people who don't equate intimacy with violence that do watch pornography. So we're looking at a subset of people that already have attitudes that are disrespectful, that represent inequality, that are supportive of violence against women and align closely with those gendered drivers of gender-based violence, that then are watching pornography and being emboldened and entitled in those pre-existing attitudes and beliefs. So when we look at younger people and children who may still be forming those attitudes, a lot of those contextual factors also come into play. So the absence of solid role models through that search of identity in quite developmental years. It can be the complete lack of sexuality education, the lack of discussions around sexuality and sex as pleasure-based, as equal, as mutual. So all of those things are really missing, that then allows pornography to become the loudest voice in the room, that really gives pornography a platform to speak to young people in those really formative years of sexual identity and sexual scripts with the absence of any other information. And so what we do see is that those attitudes become emboldened, that there's kind of a dual or multi-directional relationship between having violent supportive attitudes, watching pornography, pornography becoming more and more disrespectful, violent, reinforcing those disrespectful attitudes, and this kind of back and forth relationship that's really impacting particularly cisgendered heterosexual men in that space. And remember that pornography is a really big, broad kind of melting pot of different forms of things. But certainly, you know, when we talk about holding perpetrators to account and really looking at where some of those attitudes and values come from, they start early, and then pornography plays a role in the further development and entitlement that really stems from that experience. I guess in terms of our work with survivors and what we see in that space is, as I said, certainly identification with more adult experiences at a much younger age. We're definitely seeing much more difficulty naming an experience as sexual violence. So this real confusion around where that line is, what actually is enthusiastic consent. I didn't say no, yeah, but you didn't say hell yes either. So there's this real complication that pornography certainly plays a role in, is it does have a very predictable and homogenous script where anything from no to violence is met with pleasure or at best a neutral response from the recipient of that violence. And so when people are kind of soaked in that narrative and that sexual script, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to reflect on their own experience, and that's whether it's sexual violence or more broadly looking at intimate partner violence, and really put a name to that experience. Or as we heard in the survivor experience before that was read out, of this comparison of, oh, mine wasn't that bad, or it wasn't as bad as, I don't really qualify for accessing a service or for being able to speak out about this. Instead of having, as I said, those pleasure-based conversations where actually any violation of our boundary, any crossing of our consent or our limitation should actually be viewed and be able to be named as something that was non-consensual, that was a form of violence and harm. But there is an increasing difficulty with people of all ages, but I guess for this upcoming generation who their entire developmental experience has been influenced by pornography, but by social media and sexualised media more broadly as well. Society in general is much more sexualised, there's much more discussion of that. And I guess increasingly what we're seeing too is the kind of commodification of female pleasure for male pleasure. And so there's a confusion around that as well for young women presenting at our service around, was it for their pleasure? Were they kind of going along with something because that's sort of what you do? And again, reinforced by TikTok, by Instagram, by all those other forms of media that have something to say to young people that actually should be trusted adults saying it, but we don't say it. We don't provide it as a form of education. We just aren't counterbalancing a lot of those discussions for young people. It's not pornography's fault that it's become the default sexuality educator, and it's not young people's fault that really the only source of quality sexuality education, and I say quality in inverted commas, is pornography and the online world. Like, there just aren't better options. So I guess that's sort of the context around the pornography and the attitudes and values. And in terms of that link to homelessness, it's really, sexual violence is both a cause and a consequence of sexual violence, that it's the bit that sits in the middle. So for young women who have experiences of intimate partner sexual violence, who have had childhood sexual abuse happen or be perpetrated in their home, or sexual violence perpetrated by someone that they live with, that is a very real cause and linkage to sleeping rough, being at risk of homelessness, of moving into unsafe transitional and share housing. And those forms of accommodation that really lack that safety are then in and of themselves a cause of further experiences of victimisation and sexual violence. That's kind of the mediating thing, is it's the housing, and that is the theme of today, is the thing that really underpins it. And when we look at Maslow's hierarchy and kind of go, right, well, it's about shelter, it's not about shelter, because there's a really big difference between a house and a home. And when we want to move up that hierarchy of needs and make sure that people are really safe, they need the security and stability of long-term accommodation that allows them to plan for the future, to build a home, to build a life, not just have somewhere dry to sleep that night, which certainly is a priority and not to be overlooked, but it's what's next, what comes next. And for people who are survivors of sexual violence, a lot of those housing options that are available to people who experience domestic and family violence aren't accessible through that pathway. It's actually not eligible for refuge and a lot of those other options, particularly if you have left an experience of domestic violence and then perhaps couch surfed and then experienced sexual violence, you actually are cut off from all of those other housing options, because the predominant reason that you're then seeking it is not the domestic violence, it's the sexual violence. So there's a real gap in that, because we know that vulnerability is intersectional. And so all of those things kind of just form this quite complex melting pot that pornography is a part of, but we need to look at that broader picture as well.
Thank you so much. It really gives us insight into how complex this minefield is, but also it gives us insight into, it starts to give us some insight into the roles that laws and policies have in enabling us to respond, and how the problem's framed. I mean, I think that's quite interesting that they escape from one thing, end up couch surfing, are vulnerable to something else, which means that they can't. So maybe we could turn to you, Hilda, and you could give us a bit of insight into the situation regarding explicit material and the current state of play, and perhaps the normalisation of that type of activity. OnlyFans? I had to actually find out what that was, but I just didn't know that it had a name. And how that leads to women and children becoming more vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to speak. I suppose to start off with, so I get to work at the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, which has been a collaborative centre put together to combat online exploitation. And to start off the conversation, for us, words really matter in respect of protection of children. So we don't term child pornography at all. Pornography and exploitive images that relate to children gives a certain level of complicity towards it. So we call it abuse material or exploitation material. And that's a really critical factor, because a child can't consent to have their exploited material being procured, produced, and then disseminated online. When we talk about the prevalence of it, and I'll just go through a few stats, is that in the last year, we received over 36,000 reports from the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children of referrals into Australia of children being exploited either online or here in Australia. So those reports reference probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of potential victims here in Australia and around the world. So looking at the prevalence and the number of reports that we get in, this is where we start to get to realise that there's a large population out there that is normalising child abuse material. And when we look at that as well, our notion of who is a child sex offender is drastically changing due to the prevalence of the images online and the internet and their access to pornography as well. So once upon a time, your notion of a child sex abuser was, a white older male in their 40s to 60s, and that was what we kind of sort of had a sense of. Now we're seeing offenders as young as 19 accessing children here in Australia, getting engaging in relationships with women who have children so that they can get access to their children as well. So this cycle of the why, where are they getting these sort of inclinations from is a really critical factor. What we started to identify is that on the internet, every 7 minutes a web page shows an abuse of a child around the world. I mean, if you just look at those facts, I mean, that's just startling. I mean, the internet's there meant to be, good for us, to connect us around the world, to give us information, to give us those privacy requirements and access to information. And it does all that. But it also creates a very big schism in the vulnerabilities of women and children out there. So moving towards what we understand around the use of the internet around the world. So approximately 62% of the world has access to the internet. So that's around 4.8 billion people access the internet last month. So, and this is growing at an annual rate of 4.8%, with more than 600,000 new users every day. 1 in 3 children are internet users, and of those 1 in 3 children, 1 in 5 are sexually solicited while online. So what does that mean for us now and into the future? We know that if we have statistics about at least 1 in 5 children that happen to be as those 1 in 3 users, they are going to grow up as victims. They're going to grow up in a vulnerable set of circumstances, which leads them to be able to be victimised for other crimes into the future. We know that from the trends online and the reports that are coming into the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, that children are self-generating exploitation material. This whole hypersexuality of the generations, the desensitisation about what's appropriate and what you send online, The competition that we see driven through social media is driving children and young people to generate their own exploitive material. And then if that's not enough, we have offenders out there that are taking advantage and trying to extort even more images or extort them for financial gain. Excuse me. And then what we're also seeing is that when we are talking to our offenders that are being investigated and prosecuted for this, their conversations often quite start with, well, I started looking at pornography and then I started to get bored with that, so I started to look at other aspects of pornography, something that's more risky. And then because of the prevalence of online exploitation, there's not too many clicks away to being able to have access to child abuse material. So it's just this victim cycle that they are perpetuating themselves into, saying that it's the internet's fault and that, you know, they're getting bored with the sexualised pornography that's in front of them. The work that we have to do, though, is the partnership in the community engagement about what is acceptable online, how we can protect our children to getting away from those vulnerabilities online, but also working with tech companies to start taking down all these child abuse materials. And I'm saying there's millions of images and videos out there, and it's not hard to access that for anyone that is looking for pornography online. That connectivity between pornography and child abuse material is a slope that a lot of our offenders are going down. But we also know that our artificial intelligence that's being scraped along the internet isn't removing this content sufficiently enough to be able to then leave the consented adults pornography online. So the tech companies are just not going to be able to do it all. So it takes humans, it takes efforts, it takes us to find different ways. You mentioned OnlyFans. I mean, certainly those websites and dating websites where we have potential offenders accessing vulnerable parts of the community, women on dating sites. You know, we've seen matters where some of our offenders have gone out to women on social media and said, you can't, women with only children need to apply, that type of scenario. So we're really carefully calibrating what we do to respond against all those social media aspects. And I had my time delay, so I'll leave it there.
Okay, so we might just move on. There's lots of other questions I'd like to ask you, Hilda, but maybe we can talk about that later and during the break. But importantly, Louise, the figures about the early age of entry into the world of pornography are startling. And, you know, I think of my neighbours and the children that live around me, and they're in that age bracket. What do you learn from young people using your service about pornography's impact and the pressures they are under to access it? And how do you think that links to homelessness?
So we work with a particularly vulnerable cohort. So, you know, our youth are at risk or are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So our population is particularly vulnerable. Approximately 73% of our young people are disclosing that they have experienced family violence. So, and about 23% of them are actually disclosing that they're using family violence. So that is deeply staggering and likely to be an under-report, given it's a self-report. So, you know, our cohort are incredibly vulnerable in that regard. A huge number of our young women are reporting strangulation as a part of consensual, intimate partner relations. And it's interesting with our young people, it's very much around language. If you ask one of our young people if they've been sexually assaulted within the context of their intimate partner relationship, they will invariably say that they haven't. But then if you change the question and use different language and ask them about whether they've ever been made to perform an act that made them uncomfortable, or that felt scary or dangerous, that's when we'll get the disclosures around strangulation. And invariably, that is described as terrifying for them, and not something that they're consenting to, not that you even legally can. But, you know, so this is just the normalisation of violence for our young people. They have generally grown up with family violence in their family of origin. They are generally experiencing violence in their intimate partner relationships, and a whole cohort of them are actually using violence. So really disturbing stats for us, and we felt that we were absolutely compelled to start to find ways to address this.
Thank you. It is staggering that that type of behaviour is linked to pleasure or, you know, imagined in that way. And I guess that's sort of linked to how our brains develop and how we understand or create meaning for ourselves, and then how that contributes to how we experience things as pleasurable, which is linked to our brain. And I've had the pleasure of being on panels and working with Cheryl over the last couple of years, so I'm really keen to hear her views. So we see the impacts of this when it comes to violence and homelessness, but what's happening in the brain?
There's a couple of things. I think the biggest thing is that childhood adversity rewires the brain. And the Adverse Childhood Experiences study is the evidence behind that, and that's done around the world. And I think we often forget about that actually starts preconception right across the lifespan. And so it's this decrease in brain health that all the behaviours that we're hearing about today is a response to that. And what we're not doing is actually addressing that decrease in brain health, where the chemistry and architecture of the brain is changed moment by moment through those experiences. That's the part that's missing. And then add on to that, for our Indigenous space, the decrease in brain health because of colonisation is still impacting us today in multiple different ways. And you can see that when you go into remote Indigenous communities, where the way that men and women law is, LORE, is still experienced. That people are still trying to do the things that they did 10 to 20 years ago, but now things have changed and now they have to find a new way of working and a new way of relationship building. And that's really confusing. That can be very, very confusing as time goes on. So there's a couple of things, is that the good thing from this is the power of neuroplasticity. And I've been very fortunate enough to learn from worldwide neuroscientists that we can change the brain no matter where in the lifespan that you are. But the thing is that there's certain critical times, and it does really concern me about the 10 to 14 age group that are engaging in these behaviours, because that's when neuroplasticity is like a sponge at that particular time. So that's actually the time that we can make the most difference, the most difference. But it doesn't happen within schools. We can't keep wanting our schools to do things. And as our minister said before, it's about the weave. Which part of the weave and which part of the thread are we going to be a part of? The other thing with this is that because it changes the brains, it changes the chemistry of the good chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, all those things, so that the brain craves it. So all the behaviours that we're hearing about the increase, it's no wonder. It's because the chemistry is craving that. Now, in regards to trauma, is that if you have been through some sort of physical or emotional or whatever abuse when you were growing up, your brain will seek out adventures to keep going back to that, because it wants to relive it so it can change the neurobiology of it. So the biggest thing with this decrease in brain health is one is really exclusively teaching it in the workforce. Because in one sense, our brains, in one way, are contributing to some of the problems that we have in society, because we're not recognising where our brain health is. And as we go across the lifespan, from 40, For men, we have a decrease in testosterone, and that has an impact on our social skills and our depression, our anxiety, and how that relates to our ego and how we work in our workforce. So if that decrease in testosterone happens very quickly, that changes our chemistry in our brain, and it changes the way that we live and respond to our relationships. Now, people don't think about that, but it's actually a real true thing that happens. And the same with menopause. We know perimenopause happens 10 years before we sort of like start seeing menopause symptoms. That changes the brain. It changes the brain. Going through menopause changes the brain. So we're wanting things to keep going the same throughout our life, but our brains keep changing all the time because of our experiences during the day. But as I said before, there's power of neuroplasticity and learning about the brain in the workforce as well as everywhere else, and allowing young people to practice what they've learned. So this is the other thing that really concerns me, is that there's wonderful programs out there for interventions that might go for 6 weeks or 10 weeks. That's not enough. It is not enough to make a neurochemistry and architectural change to the brain. It just won't cut it. The second thing is that where do you practice those skills? Where's the opportunity to practice those skills? And then the third thing is, do they have the neurocognition to actually apply what they've learnt? How is their working memory? How is their cognitive flexibility? How is their inhibition control? Because their overall brain health, they can't apply what they've learnt, we're not going to change anything. So brain health matters for everyone.
Thank you, Cheryl. I always find your input so interesting, and I'm going to be optimistic there that the brain is plastic, or there is that neuroplasticity. There's hope for our children, but there's hope for us too. So just to finish...
Yeah, well, I was going to say we do have time for, a question. Is that okay? Do you want to...
Well, I was just going to ask, what do you think we need to do? Like, what's urgent? This is to all the panellists.
So you're saying if they had a magic wand and
yes.
anything at all was possible right now,
Okay.
what would you do?
Yeah.
I would screen for brain health. That's my number one thing. Very, very early onset screen for brain health. We should be doing that in schools, and we can do that in schools. It's all online now. It doesn't take long for us to do that. So that's one of the big things that I'm advocating for. We should also be screening for brain health in our youth justice system. Every time we have a young person or anyone that's not functioning, test for that. We know even dementia starts 10 years beforehand. So I'm not saying that some of our people have dementia, but what I'm saying is that decrease in cognition, which we can screen for, is number one.
Good.
I'm going to piggyback off that. Cheryl, I just think that, early intervention, we know which populations and cohorts are at risk. We've identified them, we know why they're at risk, and we have the solutions. We just need the will and the interventions to be rolled out and to target early and, with rigour.
Hilda, do you have something?
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to go with a different tact, and I'm going to focus on the internet, and that is for everyone to actually really know what our children are doing online. Life is synonymous with being online. We're not going to get away from that. I mean, research that we've done says only 52% of parents and carers actually know about online safety and what their children are doing online. 20% think it's too horrendous to talk about online exploitation. We're having children groomed whilst they're sitting at the dinner table with their devices. So I just ask your kids, your grandparents, your aunties, uncles, whatever, instead of asking them how their day went today, ask them how their online day went. And let's bring it into the vernacular that we need to know what's happening online.
Okay, and finally, Karen?
Just to hold perpetrators to account. I think we know that most of them are serial offenders, have multiple victims, so the sooner we can interrupt that pattern and hold them to account, the better the outcome will be.
So listening to that, I find it really interesting, and the message I would have is, yes, we need sustained intervention. Too often programs are pilots. We know what to do, we need sustained intervention.